everybody, and welcome to the Community Leads Call. This week we have the great fortune of having Adam Jacob of Chef fame, and also the creator of the SFOSC.org, the Sustainable Free and Open Source Communities website and initiative. And he's going to talk to us about open source and business models. And hopefully we'll have some lively discussion around that topic as well. Adam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Adam. Let's see. A little bit about me, just for context. So I'm currently the CEO of a company called the System Initiative. We're tiny and haven't actually shipped a product yet. So I don't have a whole lot to say about that, but I'm also the original author of a thing called Chef and another tool called Habitat. We also built that into a company called Chef Software, and I was the CTO of that company for about 13 years, give or take. I wasn't always the CTO. I had plenty of different job titles, but I started out as the CTO and I ended as it. So before that, I ran a consulting company. That consulting company became Chef Software. Before that, I was a systems administrator. If you really put me in a corner and ask me what I do for a living, that's still what I feel like I am, even though it's been a long time since I was probably actually a systems administrator. Before that, I worked in a comic book store, which I would 100% do again, and if I ever will. I also wrote a thing about sustainable free and open source communities that was it's like maybe longer than an essay and shorter than a book. And it was sort of born from my own existential crisis around open source and business and whether I would or would not and why start another open source business. And you can go see that stuff at sfosc.org. It's got a bunch of other things in it too. We'll talk a little about some of that stuff here, but not a ton. I also randomly talk about software engineering and on Twitter. Mostly I'm talking about heavy metal, but not only heavy metal. And then, yeah, I think important for this talk, I've mostly helped design and manage a company that ran a lot of the different models that we'll talk about here. From SaaS, loose open core, support, free software product, all kinds of things. This is a really nuanced topic. So anytime we're talking about something as complicated as open source and as complicated as business models, there are so many different layers and there's so many different things you have to understand, and they all interact, not only in the context of the company or the project that you're talking about, but also in the context of the wider ecosystem and the wider environment in which a business operates. All of those things come together to actually give you a good or bad answer to the problems of how to design the right thing for a particular business. And there are just very few people who have actually seen or can see all of those different variables and think it through. That's not to say that I think I'm one of those people. I don't know that I am, but one thing I've noticed is that in this conversation, every single person who ever touched an open source project kind of gets to be an expert a little bit in open source business models. And I just want to say that they probably aren't. So one thing that happens a lot when you talk about this is everybody gets to have an opinion, which is great. But usually those opinions lack some key pieces of insight or some key critical pieces of the landscape. So I hope from this conversation, what I can do is give you a broader understanding of the landscape in which those decisions exist so that you can be more of an expert as you go forward. One thing that always happens in these conversations is the difference between policy and law. So because we're talking about licensing sometimes, and we're talking about all kinds of other things, sort of everybody kind of winds up being an armchair lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm pretty well educated on this topic by lawyers that I love and respect, and some of whom I worked with for a long time and who put in a lot of the effort to really deeply understand these topics. But mostly here, I'm talking more about policy than law. And the delta there is that, you can have a policy for anything you'd like. And then eventually, if it becomes contentious, that policy becomes a question of law, right? Are you allowed to legally assert that you have this right or that right? But mostly here, we're talking about policy, not law. I'm probably wrong about a specific example. So I'd love it if you brought me specific examples as I talk. I'd love to talk about more about them. And you're probably right that in your specific example, whatever you're saying is true. That's probably because it's a highly nuanced topic with a ton of complexity. But I don't think I'm wrong about the big picture, right? When you think about in the broad, in the large, I think I'm pretty right. But I just want to apologize in advance and give the one big hedge, which is that it's so complicated and it's so big. And I don't think any one person can be an expert across all the different things you need to be an expert in order to really come to a great decision without a lot of deep knowledge and research. But if I spend every single minute of this conversation hedging about how I'm not an expert and it depends, then it's both no fun and very hard to have a conversation with somebody who's just constantly being like, well, it depends. But the answer is it depends. So that's the last time I'm going to hedge. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to pretend that I'm absolutely 100% correct and that I'm right all the time. I'm not, but it's a lot easier if I do that. If you would like, you can interrupt me and just ask me questions. That's no stress for me. It's kind of more fun. If you decide you don't want to do that for whatever reason, that's cool too. You can just ask questions at the end. Anybody want to interrupt me? Questions so far? Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of definitions. I sort of hate definition slides, but I feel like this is a pretty jargony conversation. So when I talk about open source, I mean open source in the context of the OSI's definition of open source. Do I have quibbles with that definition? Sure, but it's certainly the best one we have. When I talk about free software, I mean the Free Software Foundation's definition of free software. Source available means I can get at the source, but I don't have all the rights to that source, or I have limited rights to that source. When we talk about a project, I'm talking about the software usually. When I talk about the product, I'm talking about the software plus its supply chain, its go-to-market motion, its ongoing support, all of the things that actually people buy when they buy a product from someone. The community means some group of people that are unified by some kind of common purpose, right? You guys are the Red Hat community. You're all unified by your common employer, right? And there's a bigger, broader sort of Red Hat community that is unified because they're users of Red Hat, right? You're all part of that bigger community. And so we tend to overlap. When I talk about sustainability, I'm talking about the ability for a resource to be maintained at some rate forever, right? Is the easy way to think about it. So when we're talking about sustainable software, what we tend to be meaning is, can we maintain that software at the level it's being maintained or near that level forever? And then supply chain, this is the process that involves production and distribution of a commodity. So everything involved in getting a commodity from its creation to its consumer, that's the supply chain. So when we talk about open source supply chains, or we talk about the supply chain for a business, we mean the entire stretch from people building the software, how that's managed, to how it's packaged up, to how it's marketed, to how it's finally delivered to a person in the end, or people. So when I talk about sustainable, free, and open source communities, this is the lens that I tend to look at when I'm thinking about evaluating which models I think are good or bad and why. Because I think what differentiates open source from proprietary software is that we do build these communities who can take that resource and use it to get what they want. And so it's about having this unified body of people who are wherever they are, who all come together to support the creation and evolution and extension of a particular piece of software, and to ensure that that thing can meet their needs, whatever their needs may be, without compromising the ability of somebody else to meet their needs with the same software in the future. And what makes this interesting and sort of unique is that software is itself an infinite resource. So what I mean by that is that once the software exists, and it's out in the world doing what it does, there's no particular reason that everybody couldn't have a copy of that software and do what they want with it, right? That's the default state of software. It's just this. It doesn't actually mean anything. Whoa, my daughter is supposed to wake up right now. So software is an infinite thing. And when you compare that to other things we talk about sustainability with, like any kind of natural resource, that's a huge differentiator. Um, and so fundamentally, when we talk about sustainable open source or sustainable free software, what we're not talking about is making sure that people have access or that will run out, right? We're not talking about splitting a finite resource. And fundamentally, it's about individuals cooperating to get the thing that they want while making sure other people also get what they want, right? Because it's clearly not just about the software, right? Because if it was just the software, everybody can just have it and do what they want with it. That's already covered by the fact that it's open source and it exists in the world. So clearly it's about more than that. And usually when we're talking about what people want besides the software itself, what we mean is capital, right? People want money to survive, because if we don't have money, we can't survive. And the resources that we share are infinite, but they also have some requirements in order to exist, right? They need power, they need storage, they need compute. They don't just run for free. They also need humans to perform the labor, because software rots, right? It doesn't stay working forever. It doesn't stay current. It doesn't stay secure, right? And those human beings need money in order to survive. So at a certain scale, we tip from just a bunch of people working together to try to build what we need, to building companies or to building foundations or to building whatever it is, rather than everyone just either donating their time, their resources, or their money. We do that because of its efficiency and because we sort of live in a capitalist universe. Whether we like it or not, that's just sort of the world that we're in. And so open source communities trade privileges over the software itself for the right to get the capital they need to sustain themselves and to sustain the project, right? Venture-backed startups with open source channels, and I'll break that part down here in a second, often ask their communities to grant them unique privileges, right? They say, hey, I'm giving away part of this resource. I'm making part of the resource infinite. But this other piece I'm holding back. And I'm doing that so that I have the unique right to make capital and to sustain myself from this piece rather than that piece. That choice fundamentally is at odds with the idea that what you are trying to build is a sustainable community, right? Because as soon as you hold something back that would be infinite and we could all benefit from, things get weird. So there's a lot of different ways to think about adding capital into an open source project. The most common one, and the one we're going to talk about most here, is businesses. The other two are public welfare foundations. So that's like the Apache project, or industry consortiums, the Linux Foundation, right? Where the difference between them is that Apache exists to put software into the public good. The Linux Foundation exists to further Linux, right? It exists to further the CNCF. It exists to further Kubernetes. It exists, industry has come together to decide that these things should exist in the world and that everyone should use them. And therefore, we're going to pool our resources and money together in order to push this brand forward for our mutual benefit. It's a different kind of thing, even though the mechanism by which they do it looks similar. Okay, so let's talk about businesses. So this is how a business works. So at the top, you have every possible customer that your business could ever have. So we sometimes talk about this as a target market, but essentially there's this big pool of possible customers at the top. And then all those little lines coming down from that big pool of customers at the top, those are called channels, right? And so a customer comes to you through some channel. A channel might be because they used your open source software, or it might be because they read a blog post, or it might be because they went to a store, right? Whatever it is, there's some channel by which you acquire a customer. And that kicks off the sales process, right? People who show up in a channel become leads, which then they become certified leads, which become prospects, which then get evaluated, and eventually they turn into dollar bills at the bottom of the funnel, right? And this is roughly how all business works, right? You have all the possible people, you have ways you have to reach those people so that they understand what you have that they don't, and then you give them something in exchange for money. A business model is a particular business's version of that chart. So if you think about that diagram, any given business has a model. Its model is the holistic set of all of those things put together, right? Who its target market is, all the different channels by which it acquires customers, the process by which it takes those people and turns them into dollars. That's its business model. Turns out there is no open source business model. We're going to call them that anyway, because that's what everyone calls them. And as a veteran of the DevOps terminology wars, who spent a long time saying that there isn't a job title called DevOps and we should all stay systems administrators, I'm done with having that argument. So even though I think that there shouldn't be open source business models, that's what I'm going to call them, because that's what everybody else calls them. And I'm done with being the person who argues against it. But fundamentally, the reason is that open source is a channel inside of a business model, right? It's a mechanism by which, from a business perspective, I get greater access to a wider pool of possible customers, and I convince those customers that they should buy whatever it is that I'm selling. Open source channels create more opportunities, so they create more people who use your software at the cost of a potentially lower value ceiling for the same thing, right? So when I create an open source channel, I'm creating a mechanism by which people will use my software, and they may or may not be paying me for the privilege. And because there's a version of it in the world that's worth nothing, that lowers the possible ceiling of how much I can charge for the resource, right? I can only make it so scarce. And businesses require scarcity, right? So when you think about why the business model of any business works, it's because I have something, some resource, you want it, and you trade me money for the resource. That's business. But software is infinite, and open source software ensures that it's infinite. So what we have to do is find some levers for creating scarcity in the software, because the software isn't scarce on its own, right? You can just take it and do what you want with it. Therefore, there has to be some mechanism that drives someone to part with their money. And I really think of it in terms of these five. There's probably more levers, but these are the ones that I think most people can see and use. So the first is copyright. So this is ownership, right? Like, did I build the thing? Do I own it? The second is patents. Patents are the way that I constructed it is special, and so I'm the only one who's allowed to construct it this particular way. Trademarks are your brand. They're how the world knows that you make Red Hat brand Red Hat, right? Distribution rights are the ability to actually give someone a particular piece of that commodity, right? So I have something I want. I allow you to distribute it, right? The people who bring Pepsi and Coke have distribution rights to those products. They don't make the Coke, they distribute the Coke. And terms of service, terms of use. So in the SaaS world, we get to set terms on how people interact and use our hosted software. So all of this comes down to the creation of value. So when I talk about value, I'm talking about the amount of money someone's willing to exchange in order to receive your stuff, right? So you're going to pull those levers, some mixture of copyright and trademarks and patents and terms of use and distribution rights in order to create scarcity that increases the value of the product at the top. And the default value of open source is $0, right? So this is a point that often people quibble with, but the reality is it's true. There's no, once you open source something, by definition, the value of that project, that piece of software is no money, right? Because I can get it for free. Now, I may decide that I'm unwilling to put in whatever effort I need to put in to use the software, and therefore somebody else could build something that makes it easier to use or easier to get a hold of or whatever it is, and now suddenly that has value, but the software itself, $0. So the job of an open source business model, create artificial scarcity so that the value goes up from 0 in order to acquire more opportunities at the top. So there are 8, I think, open source business models. And these are my definitions. There are lots of different definitions, but these ones are mine. And since I'm the one talking to you, they're the ones you're stuck with. So the first is a free software island. So a free software island is a place where we all decide that the software will find a new home. So we'll take the software and we'll stick it on this island. And on the island, we all agree that we'll do what we need to do to make that software healthy and happy and grow. And sometimes we create that island, and we say that mostly people will monetize downstream of the island. So Linux itself is a free software island, and it's enforced by its copyright, the GPL, and a few other things. And then there's a foundation that exists, taken money to help support both the free software island and to further the interest of the growing consortium of people who monetize Linux. And so the Linux free software island takes in capital, which pays their bills, which then also grows the share for everybody, and we all move on. Kubernetes is a similar kind of model. The Apache projects are a slightly different one, where they're more in that public benefit mold, right? So the software exists for the public good, and you can downstream monetize it, but that's not their concern. Their concern is that the software is improving and that it's available for the public good. Another is the dual licensing model. So most commonly recently, this would be what MongoDB was doing, right? They're still doing it to a degree, but I think another example, if you're old enough to remember, was MySQL back in the day. Had a pretty strong dual licensing model where, depending on what you wanted to do with the MySQL client, you would need to get a license. The dual licensing model isn't my favorite. There are some people who really advocate strongly that dual licensing is a great path for sustainability in terms of, and I think they're right, in terms of individual sustainability. So if you think about a single person deciding that what they're going to do is get paid for their work, clearly dual licensing can do that. I don't think it's a particularly good tool for building sustainable open source communities, which is an important distinction for me. But things like License Zero, for example, make dual licensing quite easy to do, and I think make a lot of sense for individuals who want to monetize a particular piece of software. Okay. There's the as a service model. This is one that's growing in popularity and for good reason. And it's usually coupled with some degree of proprietary software development, but not always. So you have like the GitHubs and the Fastly's of the world who build massive as a service businesses on top of open source software. You also have things like WordPress, which I think looks a lot more like a sort of pure play as a service model. Chef tried this model. That was our original business model, was we were going to open source all of Chef. And then if you wanted to run it yourself, you could, but you would pay us to run it as a service, because who wants to run their configuration management themselves? Sadly, that was 13 years too early. And I spent a lot of years having people tell me after we had to pivot to selling software in a box, roughly in a box, distributing software, that we were idiots for not running a service. And it just made me want to crawl under my table and die. That's probably too much oversharing. But the as a service model, growing in popularity, and for good reason, because it's a pretty reasonable split. You can think pretty cogently about saying, look, the value that we provide is that we run the software on your behalf and we handle all the operational stuff in addition to all the other sort of supply chain things of its production. I think you'll see as a service more and more happen as an additional channel alongside one of the other open source business channels. Donations. This is a tried and true model. Things like Webpack have a really healthy donation model. They're running an open collective that does a really good job of distributing cash to people who want to do work or can do work. Vim has a very old donation model. The support model. This is one of the most misunderstood things. So this is often what people say the Red Hat model is, so that Red Hat sells support. It couldn't be more wrong. And in fact, I think the fact that people misunderstand what support meant was one of the worst crimes in open source business model history. And a good example for this, I think, is the original model for ZenSource. So the very, very, very early days of ZenSource, what they were was a support company. They sold support contracts for ZenSource. So it was literally support. They then wound up having sort of an open core model. And, history goes on. They eventually sold to Citrix and a bunch of other things. But what has happened a lot in the history of the support model is that people try to sell support on what is software that they valued at $0. So when there's nothing special about what you've done and the supply chain is easily available, you can easily get the software, you can run it, and there's no distinction between whether it's good or bad. The support model sucks because what tends to happen is the software gets better over time. Therefore, I need less support. Therefore, I have less revenue, which means there's less stuff coming in. It doesn't take a genius to think that this model sucks because it sucks. And so as a long-term place where you can gain value, it's a pretty tough model to follow. And there were a lot of very high-profile people who talked a lot about how the support model was broken. And that created this sort of big meme around how Red Hat was this unique thing. We'll get to that in a second. But the truth of the support model is that it is a terrible model. And luckily, and almost no one should use it. Okay, loose open core. So I put open core into two buckets. So when we talk about open core, we're always talking about there's some piece of open source software, and that's the core. And then around that core, we build proprietary software. Loose open core means that the software itself, the core thing that you do, is open source. And then we build software around the core that's not attached. So the big differentiator between loose open core and its cousin tight open core is that loose open core means that there's no feature that a user needs in order to reliably use the software at whatever scale they want to use it or for whatever need they want to use it for. But there is some extra stuff you can have if you buy the proprietary versions, right? So Puppet Labs runs this model, HashiCorp runs this model in addition to the as a service model, right? So that's loose open core. What's good about loose open core is that it does provide a very clear demarcation about where value comes in. We say that there's no value in the core, $0, but around the core, there's a bunch of dollars. What sucks about this from a business model point of view is that you wind up having to argue why whatever you've done outside the core is valuable. And usually you're trying to recapture the value that you would like to assign to the software that's in the core. And that's very, very, very difficult to do. So you essentially wind up competing with yourself, usually on the thing that you do best, which is the core. Tight open core, this is the best example I have is Elastic. So Elastic ran the tight open core play. So they took features like security and authentication and made those proprietary features. And then actually intertwingled them inside their own repository, which we can talk about why that's a good or bad idea. But ultimately, they created this thing that's tight open core. If you really wanted to use Elasticsearch in anger, either you were going to invest in rebuilding those features, which people did. In fact, they built new open source software that then got sued in order to try to stop it existing. Or you bought Elastic. What's good about tight open core is that it makes it very clear that if you're seriously going to use the software, you need to pay me for it. What sucks about it is that it's pretty hostile to the idea that what we are as a community, right? It makes it really clear that this software is unusable unless you pay me money in a serious way. Then we get to the free software product model. So this is the model that Red Hat follows, and it's the model that Chef follows. And what this model does is it uses trademark and distribution terms to create scarcity around a particular supply chain. So it says that nobody but the trademark holder, so Red Hat holds the trademark to Red Hat, Chef holds the trademark to Chef. And we say, look, I'm the only one who can create or distribute software with that brand attached, right? If you want Red Hat Enterprise Linux, the only way to get it is to get it from Red Hat, right? Under whatever terms Red Hat decides to give it to you. And what that does is it creates a unique supply chain. It says that from end to end, if you want Red Hat brand Red Hat, the only way to get it is from them, right? If you want Chef brand Chef, the only way to get it is from Chef. And it means that anybody else who decides they would like to compete with you, what they have to compete with you on is the entirety of the supply chain, right? They can't just take the software and compete with you. They have to compete with you on the entire delivery model from end to end. Engineers, quality assurance, packaging, marketing, sales, support, customer success, all of that stuff becomes the thing you have to compete on. And so what typically tends to happen is, and I say typically, there aren't a ton of examples of this model because I'm hoping that there'll be a resurgence in it because I think it's actually the best business model for most use cases. But ultimately, what happens is there's usually some community resource that becomes like a free distribution. Red Hat Enterprise Linux has CentOS. The Chef project now has a project called Sync, where some group of volunteers create an alternate supply chain, right? And they give that supply chain away for no value, right? So they make it a zero cost product. That's great because now the community gets served. If you need to have what Red Hat offers, but you can't or won't or don't need to pay Red Hat for it, you can still become an opportunity for Red Hat, right? Red Hat gets to capture you in the top of that channel because you're still an opportunity because you might decide that you do need that supply chain. And if you're a large business, especially an enterprise, the odds are you do actually need to be able to pay someone to certify that supply chain. You do actually need all of that list of things that I described earlier. And so it's not a difficult sell to say that if you want it, you have to get it from me. Now, the critical thing you have to do here is you cannot give your product away for $0. And this is the thing that causes friction because for a lot of folks, when they look at open source, what they think of is I can get a binary and I can just run it and then I don't have to pay for it. And what this creates is this sort of two-tiered distribution channel where you can get a binary to run Chef that is totally unencumbered by our proprietary terms, but you have to get it from Sync, right? And it's the same software, same project, but a very different product, right? And that has to exist because I have to certify that my supply chain is intact. And so the free software product model is, I think, a delight. Okay, I'm going to take a breath, and then I'm going to give some advice, and then maybe we'll open up to questions, yeah?
So,
questions.
I've got one for you.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, you know what? I might have missed the nuance there. So could we go back a slide, and could you differentiate that a little bit more on free software product versus that soft open core?
Yeah.
I think it's very hard, even reading up as much as I can on the subject. I'm like, how is that not open core in like some sliver of a way? You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. So open core is a very difficult thing to define. So my definitions of open core are loose and tight. There are different people, Joseph Jacks being one, who has a model of open core that basically says all software is open core, and it's just a question of like how thick the crust is or whatever. I find that definition not very useful. So here's my distinction. In a free software product model, all of the software is open source, 100% of it. There's not a single line of proprietary software that's generated. What's proprietary is the distribution of that software, right? So I create a product, it's called Chef. That product is 100% open source. There's not a single proprietary line of code anymore built by Chef, just like there's not any proprietary code built by Red Hat. However, what you can't do is get Chef, brand Chef. You can't get a distribution of Chef from me without accepting my commercial terms. I might have some commercial terms that make that $0, but it's up to me to decide what those terms are because I'm holding my distribution back from you in exchange for money. And the value you get for that is my supply chain and my certification and all of the things that are involved in creating a product rather than a project. In loose open core, I do create proprietary software, right? I create software around it that I don't open source. That's proprietary. I keep it to myself. You have no ownership of it. You have no rights. If you would like to get that software's functionality, you would need to write it yourself, right? Because it's not public. You can't just take it and do what you want with it. So the delta between loose open core and free software product is that in a free software product, 100% of the software is free. And in loose open core, some percentage is free, usually the most important percentage, right? Because that's the thing that if you don't have enough utility so that people can use your software and feel like they know that it's good and that they want to adopt it, then there's not much point in having that channel. Does that answer your question?
Perfectly. Yeah, it's such a subtle nuance, but I just needed to hear it again because
Yeah.
yeah, free software products I'm not seeing a ton of. I think there's like a such a business angle there and like a building a brand around it where it's worth purchasing
Yes.
that, it's a lot to unpack. So thank you.
It is a lot to unpack, and that it needs to be unpacked is the greatest crime, I think, in open source business model history. The deeper I looked, the more I was like, we collectively had like a weird kind of amnesia where, Red Hat discovered this model, and then when people tried to replicate it, they didn't actually understand the subtlety involved. Like the idea that you couldn't give away a version of it that's open source, like that's usually what happens. So people tried to run this play, but there was always a free download, right? You could always just download XenSource and run it. And so when they were like, we tried Red Hat's model and it failed, I would argue they never tried, because in fact, you could get XenSource without paying any money. And it was still called Xen. It was clear that you were getting it from the same vendor, right? That it had the exact same supply chain. So its value was low. Whereas with Red Hat, the only way for me to get it is to pay for it. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not open source and that there's not a project that we could collaborate on, or that if I wanted to, I couldn't compete with Red Hat directly by re-implementing your entire supply chain. Of course I could. Will I? No. And if I do, will I win? Absolutely not. Right? But yeah, it's definitely the most complicated model. And to my knowledge, there's very few companies who are running that play. Chef transitioned to running it last year. To great success. That business is healthier than it's ever been. They're having their best quarters they've ever had right now. And that's in the middle of COVID-19. So that model is working.
So I wanted to actually clarify one thing. So when you said support model, what you're talking about is what I would call the consulting model.
Sure, yeah, you can call it the consulting model. That'd be fine.
As in you're selling support, but the support you're selling is undifferentiatedly for the same open source project.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right.
And you're not creating a product brand around it.
I mean, you probably are creating a product brand around it, which you valued at $0. Right. That's the crime of the support model.
As an example of that would be Crunchy Data for Postgres, right?
Yes.
They sell support for upstream Postgres.
Docker Enterprise.
Yeah. The one of the other things I would actually one of the implied levers of scarcity that you talk about the results of, but you didn't actually include in your set of levers of scarcity, is actually complexity.
Yeah.
As in, if your software is sufficiently complex, either because it is naturally complex, which it is for something like Kubernetes, or because you simply have not bothered to simplify it, then you can effectively create scarcity simply because potential customers don't have the expertise to implement it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's legit. I think the struggle with complexity as a lever is that it sucks. Like you want to improve the experience across those axes. So I think you're right that it's a lever, but as a lever that's used in practice, what you're saying is the project we build is so hard to use and assemble that the only people who could possibly assemble it are us. Therefore, we have scarcity and value. If you're also giving it away for free, that tension is really hard to hold in your head. If you've ever been a product owner, it's brutal because you're like, well, I don't want to improve the install process too much. Don't make it too good.
But materially, this is actually what a lot of businesses and open source projects do.
Yes, I agree, and I think it's bad, but they're doing it.
And
it is effective.
One of my crusades for many years in the Postgres project was to simplify configuration.
Yes.
To adopt convention over configuration.
Yeah.
And I was never successful because the majority of people making money off of Postgres were making money via consulting.
Yes. And yes, that's why I don't love those models. You're exactly right. You're 100% right. There's just a lot of awkward behavior. And for me, what I love most about the free software product model personally is that it eliminates all of those things. The downside of the free software product model is that it runs counter to a lot of people's expectations about open source, which is that I can download binary that's called Chef or called Red Hat Enterprise Linux and do what I want with it forever. and that can make people grumpy. It turns out that I'm at peace with that. I now know that the people who are grumpy about that are people that I don't care about, to be blunt. Like, not to say that I don't want them in my world or my community, I do, but in my business, like, it's fine. If I lose those people, it's okay. Because they were probably never going to pay me anyway, and they can still be in my community if they find value in it. And they can be the very people who go and run and maintain that community distribution, which is also valuable to me. Yeah. Okay. Advice, unsolicited. But remember one of my first slides where I put a caveat. This caveat definitely applies to this one. You should never give away your core intellectual property for no value. That's the first piece of advice. So the part where you're like, we're going to open source the most important thing that we do, we're going to give it away to everybody, and we're going to have no model by which we're going to get the money back. And the idea is that, if you build it, they will come. That's a terrible plot, and it all ends in tears. So don't do that. If you benefit from having a wider number of opportunities, and most businesses do, at the cost of a potentially lower unit value, so you are lowering the ceiling probably, because there is something in the world, most likely if it's successful, that you can get for similar benefit for no value if you're willing to put in work. Then you should consider building at least one, but maybe multiple open source channels. And if you own the IP, so if the intellectual property was created by you and it is yours, the brand is yours, the software is yours. This is, basically every startup that generates a bunch of software and then open sources it, they should create a free software product channel. If that channel is the most important one, that is likely the channel that will serve you best. It's the easiest to understand. It's certainly the easiest to operate. It's kind of hard to understand right now, but I think it'll become much easier to understand if we keep talking about it. And it's easy. It's the easiest to operate. It's the easiest to understand. It's the lowest friction between you and your community. And it gives the software itself the greatest chance of being sustainable over the long haul. If the IP is actually on a free software island, then you should create what I just learned is a great word, which is a midstream free software product channel. So what you should do is create a brand that exists for your branded version of that free software island. And you should create software on top of it that makes your software better, either because it fixes the Postgres convention over configuration problem or whatever it does. And that should become your free software products channel. Or depending on the competitive dynamics, I think if there's a highly competitive environment where there's multiple vendors who are competing downstream of a free software island, you're probably better off making a loose open core channel where you leave the free software island as the core and you sort of focus on building only proprietary extensions for your particular thing. I don't know which one's right in a given situation yet, but my suspicion is that it's usually better to be a free software product. I have never seen anyone successfully run that maneuver. So just so we're clear, I think that maneuver exists, but I've never seen an example, and I hope to see one someday soon. If you benefit from the widest possible spread of the software, or you value its competitive impact more than its potential revenue impact for you, then you should create a free software island channel. This was what Google did with Kubernetes, right? They looked at Kubernetes and said, hey, if we can get everybody in the world using Kubernetes, then we can become the best Kubernetes vendor in the world, which means that we'll have a competitive leg up on Amazon, and we can start to get back some of that cloud position. Maybe we can go from number 3 to number 2, right? And so they created a free software island, which was backed by an industry consortium who all agreed that what they needed to do was compete with Amazon, which then gained enough power that Amazon eventually joined them too. So mission accomplished, right? So the value they saw in that channel was in its competitive impact more than its direct revenue impact. And almost in every case, you should probably also run the as a service channel in addition to whatever other channel you're running, right? Because at this point, why wouldn't you? More questions?
Yes, I have a couple. Well, questions, remarks, I don't know. This is Dave. So the one of the things that I've noticed around free software product and the creation of a midstream, which you mentioned, is that if you're creating a free software product on the basis of a project where you actually own the IP, there's this tension that between growing the community brand and growing the adoption of the open source and investing primarily in your commercial brand. So the free software product works well when building on an aggregation of free software islands, use your terminology, where you're taking projects that are already useful and widely distributed and adding some kind of integration or installation process or some kind of value around, Linux distributions is a classic example where you have lots of useful software. You package those pieces of software, you manage their life cycle, and that's your midstream. And then you create a product on top of that. But if you have a project that's being created as a project that will build a brand, the investment in the brand can actually detract from investment in the project and the distribution of it, which creates a tension. So one remark. I wanted to get
maybe to turn that into a question, like Adam, would you agree with that assessment?
I mean, yes, and no. So I'm going to yes and Dave. So I think we have very few examples of free software products built by vendors. To my knowledge, Chef is probably the only example right now that isn't Red Hat. And I would say that the Sync project, the open source project that is downstream, the difference in a single vendor running the free software product play is that the brand that is recognized as the free software product, the open source product, is the commercial brand, right? It's Chef. So there's not an upstream free software product. There is only Chef, and there's a downstream free distribution of Chef. And that's very different than Red Hat's model because Red Hat works on the aggregation, right? But I don't think it actually makes much of a difference. I think the important part is that you create that de facto upstream. So the midstream that you talk about is the upstream for anyone who's downstream of Red Hat's investment. And I think it's the exact same dynamics if you're in Chef. Chef is the upstream. There is a software project, it's called Chef. And that software project is 100% open source. The branding and the supply chain is not open source. My CI pipelines aren't open source. My engineers aren't open source. My marketing and sales channels aren't open source, right? So I think it works well in both cases, but the dynamics are slightly different.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on, you touched on this earlier, where VCs will typically ask for a level of exclusivity, which works against sustainability. I wonder what you think about, like, it seems like the business models that VCs push for are basically grounded in the idea that they need to get a certain level of growth and a certain margin, unit margin, high unit margin on the products that they're selling. They want to grow revenue quick to get a high valuation, and that actually works against growing an ecosystem around a project. So I've never seen VC invested companies successfully grow an ecosystem of vendors around the same project. It tends to be either tight open core or, they're all single vendor projects.
Right.
Do you think there's a way to have a VC funded company that does develop a kind of a free software project or product?
Yeah, I mean, Chef has taken 100 and change in venture capital. So the thing to understand about venture capital is that venture capitalists, the good ones, are they're investors, they're bankers. They put money in the hopes that they get a massive return, right? They actually know that they don't get a massive return all the time, which is fine because they're a specific kind of banker. But over, and the people who have enough money to give that money to a venture capitalist so the venture capitalist can invest it are specifically the kind who are willing to risk that portion of their capital in the hopes that that portion of their capital returns an outsized return. When you run a venture-backed company, and I certainly have run mine, I'm running my second, if things are going well, no one asks you questions about your open source strategy, Do you know what I'm saying? Like if it's all up and to the right, and people are using your software and you're selling it for money and you're acquiring customers, and it's not always revenue, right? There's actually multiple different ways to value a company. Sometimes it's by free cash flow, sometimes it's revenue. Just depends on what kind of growth rate you have and what kind of business and industry you're in. So when you think about venture, it's best and easiest and most true to think of it as they don't actually care what your model is, they care about outcomes. Now they also pattern match, and so they certainly aren't shy about giving you advice on what they think will work or won't work, partly because they tend to back on an individual basis things that they can understand. So all of that is to say that I don't think there's anything particularly antithetical about taking venture money to run the free software product play, right? I think the reality is that the creation of an upstream, the creation of the product and the project that supports it takes a ton of capital to do well. And so taking that capital from a venture capitalist and the idea that you're going to grow that community is great. What makes that sustainable is that upstream, that there is a downstream version that is completely free. And what that means is, and that's supported by people who don't work for the venture-backed startup. So Sync is a good example. For the first time in the history of Chef, there's a supply chain not run by the Chef software company. It's run by volunteers in the world who build releases, who distribute them to people, who do all of that work. Now, is the Sync brand going to be bigger than the Chef brand? Probably not, right? And it probably shouldn't be, right? Because the Sync brand benefits outsized from the existence of Chef software. If Chef software was to disappear tomorrow, the 6 or 8 people who run Sync would be tough to keep running Chef the way that Chef is run today, right? So you need both in the ecosystem. So I think one of the things that's happening a lot, and I'm sorry that this is a long-winded answer, but one of the things that's happening a lot now is there's a set of folks who really believe that all good open source should be multi-vendored open source. And I think those people are wrong, or they have a different thing that they want. Typically what that means is they want to be able to capture revenue from the aggregation, which works really great when you're humongous, right? So what's the downside to, or it's so outside your core business. So when you think about, giving away the core of your value or giving away the core of the software to create an upstream that you no longer control, that can be really bad. And I would argue that Docker did that and gave the core of the software to a foundation, and everyone is now more effective at monetizing that core than they were. And I don't think that was probably a very smart business decision. Now we could argue about whether it was a good community decision. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But ultimately, the way that they constructed those channels was part of the problem.
Well, and also showed one of the problems with sort of their original open core-ish, soft open core business model, which was it put themselves directly into competition with their own partners
and their own community. And I can't get over how much easier their lives would have been, I think, if instead they had run the free software product play. If they just said, like, Docker is open source and we will collaborate with all comers in our upstream. Like, everybody can use and run Docker. What you can't do is call it Docker without paying me for the privilege. And like, there'd be Docker inside stickers all over everybody's cloud sites. You know what I'm saying? Like, it'd be a whole thing.
Yeah.
But instead, we sliced it apart into pieces and we said, well, orchestration will be the valuable piece, right? We'll move up the stack into some other layer where then you lost. And like, it's a brutal thing. And it's really easy to coach the outcome after the fact. And it would have been incredibly hard to make those decisions when you were actually in the business. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just to be clear, like, I don't think I'd have made those decisions if I was running Docker when that moment was happening.
One thing, from having worked with VCs on an assortment of database startups,
Yeah.
I will say one thing that makes the free software product model, as well as the support model, but including the free software product model, a tough sell to VCs is that getting it set up is people intensive.
I mean, it's not more people intensive than any other running a venture capital play is. Like if I'm building software from scratch with venture capital money, it's capital intensive. That's the whole point. And I think it's literally no different. It's identical. Because it's the same amount of work. The difference is that you license the software a particular way. And I think if you were starting from scratch with the free software product model, which to my knowledge, 0 companies in the world have ever done. So we're completely out on a limb right now. I think if you were starting from scratch, you would probably also need to make your commercial terms free, $0 for some large segment of your population. Do you see what I'm saying? You would have to be, and maybe all of the population for some significant period of time. But you would have to always be clear that your intent was to make that pivot to, at some point, you're going to charge people money. But I don't know, because like I said, to my knowledge, 0 companies have ever run that play from the jump.
Yeah, I guess, maybe it's not more people intensive, but from the VCs I've talked to, it's perceived as being people intensive.
Yeah, and I think that perception, look, open source is perceived as being more intense and less good than proprietary software by a lot of venture capitalists. Not all of them. There are venture capitalists who deeply understand this stuff. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's the common one, in the same way that most software developers have a passing understanding of all of the things we've just talked about if they work in open source. Does that mean that they have a deep knowledge of all of its interactions? Probably not. Venture capital is no different, right? There's some who have a really deep understanding. Most people don't. But ultimately, management, my experience with venture capital is that as a leader, as a manager, as the CEO or CTO or executive or founder, the venture's pretty willing to go along with what you're wanting to do. And the proof is in the pudding. Where things get weird is when it doesn't work, right? If it doesn't work, then venture is going to be you need to do something different so that it works. Whereas if you don't take venture money, you can keep on keeping on because there's nobody there who's looking at their investment and going, I don't think that this is going to work out. And that's just, I think that's just inherent in the game, just is what it is. I don't think it's better or worse in any given model. I think one big difficulty is that the number of people in the universe who can describe the free software product model is very small. So I don't know how many people are left on this call, but now all of you probably could. And you worked at Red Hat, and I'm not sure you could before. You know what I mean? I know I couldn't before I looked at it. So the number of people who could describe it and why it works in detail, which is a thing you need to be able to do, I think is very small.
Well, thank you, Adam. We're just gone a few minutes over the top of the hour. I would like to thank you very much for this. I found this very insightful and the discussion fascinating afterwards. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you all for joining, and see you soon.
Thank you.